Hi, we went to the launch of Feed in Asia Report 2022, prepared by the Asian Development Bank. The title of the report is Leveraging Trade and Digital Agreements for Sustainable Development. My name is Sean Tan, a senior economist at ADB and one of the team leads for this report, and I will also be your MC for today. So first, I would like to remind everyone who is not speaking to turn off your microphones and cameras. And we're very pleased to have two speakers to open our event. So first, I would like to invite Albert Park to give his opening remarks. Albert is the Chief Economist of ADB and the Director General of the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department. He's the Chief Spokesperson on Economic and Development Trends for ADB and leads the production of ADB's flagship knowledge products and support for Regional Cooperation Forum. So Albert, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this year's launch of the ADB report on aid for trade in Asia and the Pacific. I'd like to start by thanking the many people who contributed to the successful completion of this report, as well as all of today's participants in this event who will be sharing their expertise and experience to provide a deeper level of insight into the report's implications. I'd also like to thank the Australian government for their kind financial support in the preparation and delivery of this report. And finally, I'd like to address a special thank you to the World Trade Organization for hosting the Aid for Trade Global Review 2022. This event gives us an opportunity to exchange views on global trade recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and how to deal with the weaknesses it exposed within the international trading system. Recovery remains uneven across the Asia and Pacific region. By focusing on leveraging trade and digital agreements for sustainable development, the topic of this year's report, this enables us to examine the catalytic role aid for trade can play in helping the least developed, lower middle income, and small island developing countries build or enhance their trade links with the global economy. It discusses how the Aid for Trade initiative can mobilize resources effectively to accelerate integration into international markets, address supply-side constraints, and overcome other trade barriers. Asia and the Pacific has long benefited from the trade liberalization, and we at the ADB believe that reports of the death of globalization have been greatly exaggerated and strongly support continued efforts to use trade as a key way to promote development. As trade agreements proliferated, they have helped the region integrate with new markets and deepen relationships with existing ones. As the pandemic showed, trade under regional agreements was more resilient and efficient than trade outside. And yet there still remains much room for improvement, and regional trade agreements present many opportunities as well as challenges. New bilateral, regional, and mega-regional agreements require countries and businesses to better understand what the agreements provide and how they relate to existing agreements, as well as how best they can be utilized. The global value chains are becoming increasingly complex, and so are the challenges of international cooperation. The global trade landscape continues to evolve rapidly. Aside from new trade agreements, there is growing complexity, depth, and rationalization of global supply chain structures, along with the wider, more extensive use of the digital economy. The pandemic continues to accelerate this digital transformation, and yet just 0.4% of aid for trade focuses on digitalization. Authorities must carefully review the digital regulatory landscape to help businesses and especially small and medium-scale enterprises join and maximize gains from a more inclusive yet increasingly secure digital economy. As emphasized in our report, we need to refocus and modernize aid for trade to reflect new economic and trade realities. The $16 billion in aid for trade deployed in our region is primarily used to promote economic infrastructure and build productive capacity. Expanding the assistance on trade policy and regulations or soft infrastructure could help all economies quantify the costs and benefits of trade and digital agreements, ensure regulatory convergence and coherence, and bring more micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises the benefits of trade and digital trade. I hope this report and the insights provided today by ADB economists, leading international trade experts, and policymakers will add to our understanding of how the Aid for Trade initiative can support economies in the Asia and Pacific region, negotiate and implement forward-looking trade and digital policies that ensure sustainable and inclusive development for all. So with that, let me close my remarks, and I look forward to today's discussion.
Thank you, Albert. Next, we would like to invite Amy Stewart to give her opening remarks. Amy is the counselor at the Australian Permanent Mission to the WTO in Geneva. She's responsible for a range of portfolios, including leading Australia's engagement with UNCTAD, as well as Australia's leadership as co-convener of WTO's e-commerce negotiations. Amy, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. And thanks so much to the ADB for having me today and for the organisers. This is a really valuable session. I'm looking forward to it. As you mentioned, my name is Amy Stewart and I work for our WTO mission in Geneva. I'm a trade negotiator, but I also have a real interest and a background in development, and my last posting was in Jakarta working on our regional economic integration program. So I found this report really very useful and I look forward to the session. Australia is pleased to fund the Asian Development Bank's 2022 report on aid for trade in Asia and the Pacific. The report provides a valuable contribution to the 8th Global Aid for Trade Review, which is an important opportunity for the global trade and development community to share lessons learned about pandemic-related constraints to participation in international trade. And the ADB report provides some useful insights focused on Asia and the Pacific. Targeted aid for trade is a key part of Australia's engagement in the Indo-Pacific. It supports our partners to capture the benefits of, for example, an open trading and rules-based system, diversification of and access to regional and global supply chains, streamlined customs procedures, contemporary trade and investment policy and regulations, and quality infrastructure, adherence to international standards, and enhanced international market access. We believe such initiatives can contribute to sustainable growth and economic prosperity throughout the Indo-Pacific. The ADB's 2022 report on aid for trade in Asia and the Pacific demonstrates the role of trade and investment in promoting economic resilience in developing countries and least developed countries, especially in the COVID-19 context. The report also highlights the need for updated approaches to aid for trade in the region to support effective participation in trade agreements, undertake reforms, and promote access to digitalisation. It emphasises the need to do this in ways that promote inclusive development and deliver the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. To fully realise the benefits of trade liberalisation and the digital economy, access must, of course, be available to all. This means promoting policies and programs that analyse and prioritise inclusivity to benefit women, young people, micro and small to medium enterprises, all of which have been disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. As Australia's Ministers for Trade, Investment and International Development point out in the foreword to the report, this is not only the right thing to do, it is essential for global economic recovery and prosperity. Societies and economies prosper when women and girls and businesses of all sizes and from all locations can participate equally. The ADB's report describes the impact of increased inequalities and disrupted supply chains as a result of the pandemic. It also importantly highlights the opportunities for developing countries' traders, including women and MSMEs, to diversify supply chains and enhance their access to regional and global markets. Australia supports the report's call for aid for trade funded research, technical assistance, and capacity building to help partner countries identify their needs and priorities in negotiating and implementing trade agreements, and support to adjust to post-pandemic trade and investment challenges and opportunities. Australia is committed to providing ongoing, targeted, needs-based aid for trade support to our Indo-Pacific partners to help them tackle the challenges of and effective participation in the digital economy and benefit from the opportunities precipitated by increased e-commerce as a result of the pandemic. The Australian government's initiatives, such as the Pacific Digital Economy Program and Pacific Regional E-commerce Strategy and Roadmap, are based on regional partnerships, which are helping to enhance regional and cost-effective approaches to supporting infrastructure, digital connectivity, e-commerce policymaking, and regulatory capacity building and digital literacy training. And those programs are helpfully set out in the back end of the report. Australia also actively prioritises women's economic empowerments and MSME in its Aid for Trade approach. Our recently concluded $5.6 million e-commerce Aid for Trade fund had a particular focus on addressing barriers to e-commerce faced by women, small businesses, and other marginalised groups in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. I recommend attending our side event this week on the e-commerce fund, which will take place tomorrow morning, Thursday, 28 July at 8 a.m. in Room B at the WTO in person or virtually. This year's Aid for Trade in Asia and the Pacific report provides a valuable contribution to understanding the contemporary trade challenges and opportunities in our region and the important role Aid for Trade can play in promoting economic growth, resilience, and inclusiveness in the Indo-Pacific. I would like to thank the Asian Development Bank for hosting this event, today's speakers for their contributions, and participants in the room and online. I look forward to hearing from our experts today and engaging on the report and its findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. So Elvid and Amy spoke about the importance of aid for trade in Asia and the Pacific, which leads nicely to the presentation of our report. So the first part of the presentation will be presented by Pramila Crivelli and the second part by myself. So Pramila is an economist in the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department in the ADB. She's one of the team leads for this report. So Pramila, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sean. I will be sharing my screen. Let me know if you can see it.
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. And today I have the pleasure to introduce you to our new publication, as already mentioned, Aid for Trade in Asia and the Pacific, that will focus on how to leverage trade and digital agreements for sustainable development. I would like also to mention, so we prepared this project together with Sean, and we were assisted by a fantastic team at ADB that I would also like to sincerely thank for their support. So let me start by giving you a brief overview of the content of this report. The report is structured into two parts. In the first one, we look at the Aid for Trade landscape, Aid for Trade flows, and discuss how Aid for Trade can help developing countries to tackle challenging trade environment, and in particular the impact of COVID-19, the rising inequalities, and supply chain disruptions. In the second part, we focus on regional cooperation issues, highlighting the importance of for Aid for Trade to address the growing regulatory heterogeneity. And in fact, if not coordinated, Aid for Trade restricted to national programs may even exacerbate this heterogeneity. So regional cooperation is particularly important, and this is why we advocate more cooperation in soft infrastructure, that is trade policy and regulations. And given the growing importance of regionalism and the emergence of mega-regional agreements, we investigate how regional trade agreements can help mitigate the risks associated with geographical diversification by providing, for example, alternative export destinations and promoting robustness and resilience of the regional trading system. And at the same time, COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the need to support developing economies address emerging challenges related to the digital economies, safeguarding security, data protection, and other domestic interests, while at the same time ensuring, we have an enabling environment for digital trade. So let me give you further details. Aid for Trade flows to Asia-Pacific countries almost tripled between 2002 and 2019. And you can see on screen the evolution over time of the total disbursements by regions, with the amounts in the upper panel and the regional shares in the lower panel. In 2017, between 2017 and 2019, the Asia-Pacific region received 35% of average global Aid for Trade flows. And in 2019, Aid for Trade inflows to the region even totaled to 16.4 billion, which made Asia and the Pacific the second highest recipient in the world after Africa. And within sub-regions, we observe disparities with the larger portion going to South Asia with 53%, followed by Southeast Asia. And you can see the other shares on screen. The Pacific received about 4% total inflows, keeping in mind that those shares would also change dramatically when we will look at the shares in terms of, for example, GDP per capita. And all these statistics you can also further find in our report. Least developed countries in Asia and the Pacific accounted for 36.1% of total inflows in 2020, with substantial increase to Bangladesh, Myanmar, and Solomon Islands, and also substantial decrease in Afghanistan in the last 5 years. Now, we discussed the recipients. What about the donors? Well, we see that the year 29 marks a turning point in the distribution of donors. And since 2010, regional support for aid for trade outpaced contribution by non-regional members, or non-regional donors. You can see this on the slide with the increasing share of regional donors, which is the green line in the graphs or the green bars in the lower part, and the decreasing shares of donors that are not located in Asia, which is the gray line or the gray bars. And in fact, the share of donor countries not located in Asia and the Pacific decreased by 11.5 percentage points between 2009 and 2019. At the same time, disbursement from multilateral donors, including ADB, increased by 10.5 percentage points. And it is also interesting to note that the regional disbursements are also highly concentrated. In 2020, Asian Development Bank, Germany, Japan, and the World Bank contributed about 3/4 of aid for trade disbursement to Asia and the Pacific. Finally, an important feature that also motivated us to choose the topic of leveraging trade and digital agreements is the fact that aid for trade flows is mostly directed to economic infrastructure, while flows targeting trade policies and regulations remain limited. And the portion of official development assistance going to aid for trade in Asia and the Pacific rose to 40% in 2019. However, it dropped significantly following the COVID-19. And the magnitude of this decline was larger for Asia-Pacific countries compared to developing economies taken together. And this decline is mostly and is entirely attributable to the decrease in disbursements directed to economic infrastructure. Now, that is what you can see on the left charts, and you see the red line that is decreasing in 2020. Nevertheless, economic infrastructure remained and remains now the largest category in cumulative aid for trade disbursement in the region. And in fact, this category accounted for 71.4% over 2017-2019 period. And finally, in 2020, it reached 10 billion. In contrast, disbursement to trade policy and regulations more than halved in Asia Pacific from 2018 to 2020. And in fact, it fell to 1.3% in 2020, which is in fact relatively low. And let me skip to the next slide. While this aid for trade in policy and regulation is very limited, it has a great potential to support better design and effective trade agreements, which is critical to support sustainable development, and which is also the reason why we have drafted chapters on regional trade agreement and digital agreements. For example, trade under trade agreements has been more resilient in the pandemic shock, and also regional agreements and the emergence of mega regionals such as the RCEP or the CPTPP provide opportunities to strengthen the regional value chain, especially thanks to some provisions such as cumulation if fully implemented. Now, the potential gains are massive, but as I just mentioned, they are conditional because it will depend on the value added of of new agreements over existing agreements, because as we all know, new agreements do not supersede existing ones. And first of all, it will depend if the countries have negotiated favorable access to the market. Sometimes new agreements do not bring additional market access. Will depend if these agreements promote regulatory convergence or tend to enhance heterogeneity, adding an additional layer to the noodle ball of overlapping rules and regulations. And finally, it depends also if at the end those agreements are effectively used by the private sector, or if they are just signed and basically not used at all. So that's why A4Trade needs to help identify the costs and benefits of new and existing agreements, as some agreements do not bring much of additional market access. And the difference is most often in the fine print of the agreements, such as on rules of origin, cumulation, non-tariff measures, and all the other regulatory issues. So we need to help developing economies and develop better evidence approach to the design, negotiation, and implementation of these agreements. Finally, the report also look at how we can use utilization rates to monitor trade agreements, and also stress the need to develop other tools. Few details about what I just mentioned. First, on measuring the incremental value of an agreement. Why do countries need support? Well, because this is an extremely challenging and difficult task. Just imagine if you take an example, Vietnam and Japan, they have already, just this bilateral pair has 4 types of different agreements. ASEAN-Japan, Vietnam-Japan bilateral FTA, you have our CEP, CPTPP, and on the top we also have the unilateral scheme of GSP. Most recently, Cambodia has signed an agreement with the PRC, but both countries are also part of RCEP, and those 2 agreements, RCEP and the bilateral agreements, just entered into force at the exact same date, at the same time. So to understand, which agreements brings more value and what the private sector may do and how to make sure that it has been negotiated properly and how it can also improve in the future, you need to look at different issues. In the trading goods, we have a better idea because it has been studied already, but we have some tools, but they are quite complex because you need to look at the tariff schedule, the differential, rules of origin, cumulation, certification, and you have to look at it throughout thousands and thousands of tariff lines. And you need also a qualitative analysis. It cannot be just quantitative. You need text-based or side-by-side reviews of legal provisions to, identify the meaning of the overall market access and national treatments, and quantification methodology to rank this degree of liberalization, which implies qualitative assessment. Now, on other areas, is even more challenging, SPS, services, TBTs, or the regulatory issues, because we don't have specific tools. And it means A4Trade is really needed also to develop methodologies for each of those new disciplines to assess these developing countries with tailored capacity building. On utilization rates, just a few words on why it is so important. It is very important because it measures, the share of trade utilizing a preference out of the total trade that is eligible to receive it, given the coverage of the agreement. And it's very difficult to interpret because low utilization suggests that the preference schemes is not working properly, but high utilization may not always be positive signs because they can hide some sort of, other elements such as small trade values. So you need a careful assessment about these. But they are very useful, despite some governments might be reluctant to use them, but they are really useful in increasing transparency, measuring the effectiveness of various overlapping trade preferences. Example here is if you have a Cambodia utilization rates in the ASEAN-Japan, that was about 10% in 2018, and you have 80% for the Japanese GSP. And so here we all know that the Japanese GSP provides more lenient rules of origin, so we can draw best practices in terms of rules of origin and specific provisions from different schemes. So these utilization rates provide also the necessary information to governments and policymakers to determine which preference schemes best suits their firms, which is quite important to know, and formalize or revise trade agreements, so new or existing trade agreements. Lastly, the reports feature a section, a whole section devoted to preference erosion and graduation, because these are quite, I would say, topical at the moment. Several least developed countries in the region will face difficulties in the future, and we need to get prepared. There have been many LDCs, Asian LDCs have been relying a lot on unilateral trade preferences schemes, and it means they are exposed to preference erosion. What does it mean? It means that either they will graduate from the least developed countries categories, and they will not be able to benefit from these unilateral preference schemes in the future. Or simply, there are a lot, as we mentioned earlier, bilateral FTAs and other FTAs that are signed in the regions. So which means even without graduation, preferences are eroding by other agreements. And you have also bilateral FTAs, of course, and mega regional. So the policy options, we explore the policy options, which are either use standard GSP or join new open plurilateral, just like the mega regional, negotiate new agreements, or start using existing FTAs, like is the case, for example, in when you have already bilateral agreements, but you are using GSP. So overall, we have substantial negotiating challenges ahead. And the report also features more details about utilization. As you can see on the right, these are two examples. You have more examples in the report showing that utilization rates jumped into 2010 after the European Union reforms of erosions to almost 100% or 80%, showing a very high reliance of some countries to these trade preferences and making them automatically more vulnerable. So that's it for my part. Now I give the floor to Sean for the second part. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pramila. So aside from leveraging trade agreements, the report also argues that countries have to prepare for the digital economy. So we know that there are many opportunities for countries where digital connectivity can be a key driver for economic integration. It can strengthen firm productivity and innovation, as well as encourage more trade. But there are also risks involved. A digital divide can emerge if developing economies cannot participate meaningfully in the digital economy. There could be also increasing barriers and restrictions to digital trade, as well as a lack of interoperability in different systems, as well as regulations. So as digital rules are being written, developing economies may not be at the table due to a lack of capabilities or interests. Next slide, please. So in Asia, there's a complex digital trade regulation landscape. The diagram on the right represents the various groupings and agreements that contains digital rules. So we have the ASEAN e-commerce agreement and APEC in the center. And this overlaps with the other mega regionals in the region, which are the CPTPP as well as the RCEP. And these connect with other plurilateral and bilateral agreements like the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, as well as the PACER Plus. And all this is happening in parallel to the WTO Joint Initiative on e-commerce. So one thing to note is that although there are many agreements in the Asia and the Pacific, some of the strongest performers in the growth of digitally delivered services in the regions are absent from the picture, like India, a digital services giant. Next slide, please. So our report highlights one innovative approach to digital economy agreements in the region, and this is the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, DIPA, between Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore, signed in 2020. It has a broad scope that covers trade in the digital economy, and it focuses on 4 enabling elements. The first being end-to-end facilitation of trade, trust, innovation, and inclusion. The agreement assumes that the digital economy will keep evolving, so it has soft norms, it focuses more on interoperability and coherence, and it allows new issues to be added to the agreement. And it has an open plurilateral format, so new members are welcome to join. And currently, South Korea and China have requested to participate. So this agreement offers the greatest potential for developing economies, as it is a building block to broader outcomes, such as a WTO agreement or other trade agreements. And it also gives an opportunity for developing countries to participate to help write the rules. Next slide, please. So what is the future of digital trade rules? Can this deeper style model help to achieve greater coherence overall? So it can, or it may streamline trade rules across the region, but equally it can also struggle to build sufficient critical mass amongst the countries. And some of these deeper elements can be included in the revision of existing agreements or the negotiation of new ones. For example, the CPTPP or the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA, as well as the US Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. There is also a question of how do these individual models or upgraded free trade agreements interact with other agreements. So what can Aid for Trade do in this case? So they can play a role in helping developing countries engage in the digital economy. So currently only 0.4% of Aid for Trade goes to digital economy issues. Aid for Trade can support countries in achieving digital connectivity and infrastructure, technology access and digital literacy and skills. It can also help them identify regulatory heterogeneity, ways to promote cooperation, coherence, and transparency of regulatory settings. Next slide, please. So let me end our presentation with a quick summary of the policy recommendations we have in our report. So the report argues that there is a need to reorient Aid for Trade, and it can be done in three broad ways. First, Aid for Trade can focus on building technical tools and knowledge to support policy dialogue and awareness raising. And this can be done by assessing the incremental value of regional trade agreements as well as digital agreements. It can also help build mechanisms for notification of utilization rates, databases, as well as user-friendly rules of origin, as well as explore new models and other key areas for regional trade agreements. The second, there can be country-specific technical assistance and capacity building on trade policy making for graduating LDCs, building a regional website targeting small and medium-sized enterprise, looking at digital trade policies as well as domestic regulatory settings for the digital economy. And third, Aid for Trade can provide trade-related adjustment assistance to graduating LDCs as well as to developing countries suffering from trade diversions. So some of these topics will be picked up and elaborated in the following discussion. Next slide, please. So thank you so much for your attention in our presentation. So let me move on to the next session in our event. The next session is a panel discussion with an exciting lineup of speakers. So the panel discussion is moderated by Jong-Woo Kang. Jong-Woo is a principal economist and OIC for the Economic Regional Cooperation and Integration Division at the Economic Research and Cooperation Department of the ADB. So Jong-Woo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, both Pramila, Sean, for setting the very useful stage for the panel discussion for today. I think that your presentation have provided very succinct summary of the main message of the report, which is why we need to refocus the Aid for Trade by the donor community into the area of the capacity building of the developing countries. So far, the main focus of Aid for Trade has been on the expanding the infrastructure and the productive capacity production capacity of the developing country, and why we need to expand the focus to engage in more capacity building programs for the developing countries. So with that, I'm very pleased to have the distinguished panelists joining us today for this session. I'd like to ask all the four panelists to turn on their video so we can have the interactive discussions. So let me briefly introduce each one of them. Mr. Francesco Abetta is the adjunct professor of International Economics and Development Cooperation in the University of Turin, Italy. And he is the senior international trade consultant to international organizations in developing Asia, Africa, and Latin America and Caribbean. Our next panelist is Ms. Stephanie Honey, who is the founder of the Global Trade Insights, and she is a trade policy consultant with expertise in digital trade, regional economic integration, especially in Asia and the Pacific, the WTO, service trade, agriculture trade, and inclusion, especially trade and gender issues. And our next panelist is Mr. Andrea Giacomelli, who works as aid for trade and trade policy advisor at the permanent delegation of the Pacific Island Forum to the United Nations, WTO, as well as other international organizations in Geneva. Last but not least, Mr. Roy Ragolago is the newly appointed head of the PACER Plus Implementation Unit and Labor Mobility based in Samoa, which is an international organization set up to implement the PACER Plus agreement, strengthen the capacity of the Pacific countries to benefit from the PACER Plus as well as the other regional and international trade agreements. I think with that, we can have some insightful and interesting discussion building on the presentation already made by both Pramila and Sean, based on the just released State of Trade report by Asian Development Bank. So let me first start with Francesco. The report points out many developing countries and LDCs encounter difficulties in negotiating and implementing new generation FTAs, in particular, given their low capacity and expertise. So our report suggests redirecting and refocusing it for trade resources to fund more development of the research coupled with regional and country-specific capacity building programs. I understand you have extensive experiences in leading the capacity building program, or in particular developing countries. So based on your extensive experiences, what would you recommend for this assistance to be practically delivered? And what could be the best practices or key elements from your perspectives? Francesco, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Khan. As you know, not all capacity building programs are created equal. Like with marriages, some of these programs have been highly successful, others less so. Today, I will focus on top 5 Asian programs spanning over the past 25 years. 2 of them were implemented by UNCTAD, those dealing with accession of China and Cambodia to WTO. 2 others were financed by the EU. The first involved China's regulatory convergence and support to the EU-China trade policy dialogues. This was one of the largest projects of the EU. The second was focused on Vietnam, probably the longest running project in history, lasting about 20 years. It covered accession to WTO, implementation of WTO agreements, and negotiations and implementation of the EU-Vietnam FTA. The fifth and more recent project is a joint EU-UNCTAD activity for the LDCs. What are the common ingredients of those programs? 5 factors explain their success. First, they were all demand-driven, based on custom-made, tailored activities. They were responses to urgent, immediate concerns of the recipient countries, the owners of the project. Ownership was the key ingredient. Second, they were all results-oriented, based on forward-looking approach to get concrete results like concluding FTA negotiations. Third ingredient, involvement of private sector and civil society, not just trade officials. Fourth component, strong donor coordination. And in this context, I would like to mention 2 projects. The project dealing with Cambodia accession to WTO under the Enhanced Integrated Framework, EIF, for the LDCs. EIF is a donor coordination structure that is worth considering in setting up a new AFT initiative for the region. Another example in this area, although it was not applied to Asian countries, but to African countries, is the Joint International Trade Assistance Program, GTAP, involving UNCTAD, WTO, ITC. GTAP was able to develop synergies, complementarities, and cross-fertilization among the agencies. Each of them exploited their comparative advantage. Fifth ingredient, involvement of think tanks, especially those with a track record of carrying out both research and capacity building activities. And I would like to mention two examples in this area. First, the European University Institute based in Florence, which has developed in partnership with UNCTAD a tailored research and capacity building program for LDCs delegates to WTO. And this program has strongly enhanced their negotiating capacity in selected trade topics such as rules of origin in a very efficient manner. Second example is the World Trade Institute at the University of Bern, combining a rich research portfolio and high quality training activities. In conclusion, I strongly hope that these ingredients will constitute the pillars of the activities of the proposed a new AFT initiative that is being made in this, that's been proposed in the report that's been launched today. And this activity should be based on effective donor coordination and promote evidence-based research, demand-driven, and custom-made capacity building. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Francisco. Thank you very much. I think you have highlighted very important points, which can be applicable not only to the aid for trade, but also the assistance to the developing countries by donor community at large. Because the points you have raised, such as the ownership and the demand-driven private sector involvement and the better coordination among the donor community should be applied to all the donor community activities in supporting the developing community at large. So with that, I think I'd like to move to the Stephanie, because the second part of the presentation, which was covered by Sean, was talking about the digital economy agreement, referring to the recently signed the DEPA between Chile, Singapore, and New Zealand, for example. And then according to the presentation, most of the existing digital economy agreements involve developed countries, and then the developing communities are largely missing from the landscape. And given the increasing complexity and heterogeneity of the digital trade regulations, I'd like to ask you what you think are the key areas for support for developing countries in terms of assessing the benefits of the new digital economy agreements and eventually handling negotiations or accessions in the case of the open plurilateral agreement in this area. Stephanie, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And it was a great privilege to be involved in writing this part of the report. And as Sean explained, as you've said, it's a very fragmented landscape for digital trade rules and also a very complex one. And certainly the most innovative thinking is being done in these new digital economy agreements, especially as you said, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. And part of the rationale for these new agreements is to create greater coherence, so to strip out that heterogeneity. But it's really critical that developing countries take part in these processes and these conversations, because really the rules of the road for digital trade are being developed, being written right now. And developing countries need to be equipped to participate in those conversations and help to co-design the rules. You know, they can't afford to stand back and just have rules imposed on them. There are some very clear priorities. Firstly, developing countries need to have their good domestic regulatory settings and policy settings in place. So ideally, there would be a national digital economy strategy to set the overall direction, and then some really important regulatory building blocks in place. So in areas like data protection and privacy, cybersecurity, electronic transactions frameworks, consumer protection. And we know that not all countries in the region, not all of the developing and emerging countries have those regulations in place now. So there's a really important preparatory stage of getting those domestic settings in place first. But in addition, there are some sort of built on top of that, some other important digital trade facilitation measures like e-payments and sort of fintech, e-invoicing, and even for physical goods trade, the digital, enabled paperless trade that will help to really allow those economies and small businesses and so on, and underserved groups, women, to take advantage of the digital economy. But when it comes to the trade policy side, it really demands a very deep, broad and agile set of skills and understanding. So you need to know about services trade, how the technology works, the interplay of different parts of the digital economy, so sort of end-to-end transactions, the legal and economic implications. And then there are a number of other areas of trade policy that are very relevant and important too, like intellectual property, privacy, I mentioned competition policy, all of which are very complex and sort of evolving quickly in the digital economy. And this area of evolution means that policymakers are going to need to know how to regulate things like artificial intelligence or digital identities, data innovation. So there's a lot going on and it needs a big skill set. As well as that, policymakers need to know how to measure digital trade and understand the economic impacts, and that is not straightforward either. And as well, a process to stay engaged with stakeholders, civil society and business. Obviously, that's critical for social license, but also because, particularly in the case of businesses, they have the deep understanding of what these new models of business actually mean in sort of policy, economic, legal senses. But I think it's important to bear in mind that this isn't just a challenge for developing economies, it's hard for developed countries too. And these new digital economy agreements actually offer, in a way, a kind of platform for shared learning. The rules can be co-designed together, which is actually part of the structure of these new agreements as well, that there are sort of soft norms and opportunities for engagement and collaboration that will eventually lead to sort of hard law, to binding trade rules. So they're a really important aspect of digital trade policy making in and of themselves. Some of them, like the Singapore-Australia Digital Economy Agreement and the ASEAN e-commerce agreement, do actually build in regional capacity making, but much more is needed. And I think that's one of the really important messages from the report, that we need to be focusing some of the aid for trade expenditure in this area. And just to finish on a really positive note, with great kudos to Australia and Singapore and Japan and the other participants in the WTO joint initiative on e-commerce. Wonderful to see them launching the new capacity building framework that just happened last week. That's a really important and positive initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. You have pointed out very crucial points in terms of supporting the developing countries to be part of the international discussions about the digital economy, digital agreement. I mean, how to pursue the domestic reforms in the areas of cybersecurity, privacy, data protection, and consumer protection, et cetera, and also how to facilitate the digital trade by supporting the data-related regulation of the data localization and the data protection, et cetera, et cetera. Also, the statistics-related capacity. I mean, that's some areas where the donor community can put more emphasis in supporting the developing countries in terms of capacity building programs in the future. So with that, let me now move to the Roy, now switching the gear a little bit to the area where your expertise lies. I understand Australia and New Zealand have provided the resources to support the implementation of the PACER Plus. And then I'm just wondering how the system used in the practice to make sure the PACER Plus is implemented and how your programs are supporting the exporting companies that have to deal with the complex nexus of origin criteria and certification, SPS and TBT, among others. So I'm just curious about how your programs are supporting the countries in the region, and how do you perceive whether there could be some room for improvement in the future. So Roy, over to you.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. And down here in the Pacific, here in Samoa. Thanks for the question. I think it's important to emphasize that it's not just Australia and New Zealand that provided resources to support the implementation of PACER Plus. I know the parties that have ratified and signed the agreement have also made significant contribution to support the implementation of PACER Plus. And I think during the support of the readiness package to prepare parties for the implementation, this was driven directly by the Pacific. And I think this element was really important to ensure that, as some of the panelists have already mentioned, that in preparation, that the preparation was fit for purpose, given the different development stages that countries are at. I think just some of the things that we did in practice, that we're doing in practice at the moment, is just looking at basic things to help parties, such as translating PACER Plus products into the local languages, creating how-to videos in local languages so that communities can understand what PACER Plus is all about and look for opportunities to take advantage of what is available on the PACER Plus. And while this might seem a bit basic, I think some of the panel members have already mentioned about reaching out to the community. That inclusivity is really important. So these are just some of the things that we're doing as part of PACER Plus to try and bring in those communities to understand what PACER Plus is all about. I think some of the other services that we're providing in a practical sense is providing small and medium enterprise businesses with ability to be able to check some of the labels of some of the goods that they would like to export, which is really important for them to be able to get their products into either Australia, New Zealand, but also other PACER Plus parties. Recently, we provided some tools such as harvest bins to the farmers to allow them to transport their products, which is really important for in the SBS space, especially around some of the compliance and regulations that are required for keeping these products safe and be able to be exportable. Other areas that we're looking at, and once again, other panel members have already mentioned this, is the automation of processes so that exporters and importers can clear goods from their smart devices, given the advancement of technology, the implementation of the Azakuta system among the PACER Plus parties has been really useful, not only for compliance, but also for the private sector in our communities to be able to easily access various public services online, which is really useful. We're also looking at activities, and of course the other members have mentioned this, fit for purpose capacity building activities, which involve, and especially under PACER Plus, we have quite a big focus on the private sector, communities, women in business, youth, and people with disability, focusing really in-depth focus on them and how to bring them into trading activities, but also focusing on the spectrum of the supply chain, not just the public sector, but assistance to farmers, growers, manufacturers, suppliers, potential buyers and investors. And we use a number of modalities to deliver some of these trainings by using online training workshop, video, trainer programs. One of the big things that we're really focused on is promotion of ownership of the programs and sustainability at a national level. We're always looking at this in the aspect of, if the PACER Plus implementation unit was no longer around, would the interventions that were implemented or made be sustainable? Would countries be able to continue this work? And I think that's always something that we think about when we're implementing activities to support aid for trade is if we were to walk away and turn off the lights tomorrow, will the interventions we've made continue on? And so the final element that I just want to touch on, which is really important, is the monitoring and evaluation, which some have already mentioned, to check progress and to see if the interventions we've made are having an impact, which I think is really important. But I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Roy. Thank you very much. I can clearly understand how rich programs the PACER Plus program has to support capacity building of the developing countries in the region. Okay, so with that, I recall that the e-commerce is quite a crucial part of the digital economy at the moment, and which was also emphasized during the Amy's opening remarks, and also joint initiative on e-commerce was also highlighted by Stephanie during her intervention before. So I'd like to move to Andrea now. I understand that you have conducted a lot of work on delivering e-commerce aid for trade assistance in the Pacific under the umbrella of the Pacific E-commerce Initiative. And then based on your experiences, what are the major gaps you have identified in terms of the regulatory framework for the e-commerce? And then what do you think the key AFT areas could be among the international community that can support the development of digital trade in the Pacific? So over to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Young, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. As you rightly point out, e-commerce is a topic which is very important for the Pacific. Our region is the smallest and the most isolated region in the world. And it follows that obviously any tool that we can use to reduce the impediments caused by distance, a small size is key to Pacific development. This is the reason why e-commerce, which allows to use virtual channels for businesses to connect with clients and with other businesses across the globe, was prioritized as one of the priorities of our Pacific Aid for Trade strategy 2020-2025. Regional work on e-commerce started in 2017 under the umbrella of the Pacific E-commerce Initiative. And like with all our other initiatives that the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat coordinates in the region, we started with national harmonized diagnostics. We conducted diagnostic studies in 11 of our members using the methodology for e-commerce assessments that developed by the UNTAD. And those assessments eventually informed the development of a Pacific regional e-commerce strategy and roadmap, which was approved by our ministers in August 2021, and which was kindly funded by the government of Australia, whose representative referred to before as one of the deliverables of their Aid for Trade e-commerce fund. Now, the strategy and roadmap adopted in 2021 includes 54 measures, and several measures relate to digital trade rules. There was the presentation by Stephanie. She was talking about first getting the strategy, and secondly getting the regulatory building blocks, if you like. And the regulatory building blocks of some of them, at least, are some of the recommendations included in the strategy. For example, the strategy recommends, first of all, the harmonized adoption in the region of WCO frameworks of standards for cross-border e-commerce. We know that e-commerce is a big issue for customs. A lot of customers are not able to trace e-commerce transaction, they lose revenue, but on the other hand, they also have the duty to facilitate. So they cannot treat e-commerce transaction like you treat a large shipment. So this WCO framework of standards, if adopted in an harmonized way, can facilitate e-commerce. Obviously, then you have countries need to talk to each other. And so in order to talk to each other, our recommendation there is to adopt the framework agreement on facilitation of cross-border paperless trade in Asia Pacific, because that allows the transactions, e-commerce transaction that relies on electronic data to be exchanged and mutually recognized. Eventually, at country level, other building blocks are the adoption of key legislation. Our strategy recommends adoption of UNCTRAL model legislation on economic transactions. This kind of legislation responds to the advances, to the question that the advances of digital trade pose for regulators. But beyond electronic transaction, there are also other areas of laws that were quoted by previous speakers: data protection and privacy law, e-transaction, cybercrime, consumer protection. These are all building blocks that, based on model legislation, our strategy recommend to adopt. You can think, for example, that none of our members has data protection and privacy law in place, and just 21% of our members has e-transactions laws in place. There are other international standards related to payment that we suggest to harmonize. We do have established a regional initiative which is called Pacific Quality Infrastructure Initiative. It does allow the harmonization of regional standards in any sector, so e-commerce standards could be easily harmonized through this regional initiative. And eventually, the final recommendation that we give, if you like, is to build the skills, because like you say, we can have regulation, but then our members, after have the building blocks in place, they need to engage. And in order to engage on those negotiations that can eventually lead to the digital agreement, be it regional or multilateral, we do need to build capacity for engagement. We have already acted on many of these areas together with our partners. For example, ESCAP has conducted a readiness assessment on cross-border paperless tracing to Tuvalu and Tonga. UNCTRAL has contributed to model legislation development and approval in Fiji, PNG, and Kiribati. The UNCTAD is conducting legal gap analysis on the other types of legislation beyond e-commerce transaction. And the PIFS has recently provided capacity building for e-commerce negotiation through a 4 weeks e-commerce training course, which will go online on the 24th of August, date in which we will launch an e-commerce portal, which was one of the recommendations from a previous presentation by Sean, if I'm not mistaken. And you are obviously all invited on the 24th of August to take part to this launching, which will be a portal for us MSMEs and will be launched in an hybrid way. I think I'll stop here because time is over. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you very much. So I fully agree with you that the importance of the harmonizing and the standardizing the different regulations about e-commerce across the borders. So that's why we need to pursue more regional cooperation and multilateral cooperation on various fronts. And also, I hope that the development member country will be the crucial part of such international discussions going forward. I wanted to have some more rounds of discussion, but given the limited time we have, I just ask one question. I mean, in the Q&A box, we got one question from the audience. The question is about the digital economy related agreement. And then the many provisions of those agreements refers to cooperation or encourage certain practices. This implies things would happen at the implementation stage. In practice, how the exchange of such information is taking place? I think that is the question, because usually digital economy agreement just states some kind of cooperation or encouraging certain practice, but at the end of the day, what's important, what kind of actual cooperative activities could take place on the grounds, and how that kind of the actual cooperation is taking place on the ground. I think that's the question, the core of the question. I think may I direct that question to Stephanie, based on your expertise in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks for the great question. It's a really important point, because you're absolutely right. These digital economy agreements are very much grounded in the sense of the cooperation, the collaboration, the engagement among the parties in an ongoing way. So there are certain institutional structures to enable that. So joint committees and processes where the parties to the agreement, so for example, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement lays out areas where these conversations or discussions where the conversations will take place. And another sort of model of this or aspect of this is, for example, under the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, There's a formally constituted SME dialogue, so about and involving small businesses. And in fact, I was very privileged to be involved in organising and helping to moderate the first one of those dialogues that took place a few months ago, that focused on the fintech sector, which involved policymakers, but also businesses coming together to sort of share ideas about how that part of the digital economy should be regulated, what's needed in a trade policy sense. So there's that sort of forum and platform as well. But in addition, some of the other digital economy agreements have actually got associated memoranda of understanding. So a sort of a roadmap, if you like, to a work program to actually develop the detail of things like mutual recognition of digital identities and a host of other areas. So it's a very engaged, deliberate process of sharing experiences and best practices and trying to co-design and think about the best way to regulate and design trade rules for these areas. So at the moment, those are, just looking at your question there, do others, non-parties, have access? At the moment, not really. I mean, they are for the parties to the agreement. But in the case of DEPA, for example, that is open to others to join. It's an open plurilateral, so potentially, you know, there's a path into those conversations that way. But I think the key message is that nobody has all the answers in this area. You know, it's important to share the experiences and the ideas across the different parties, and then take those ideas out into things like the WTO joint initiative or other regional agreements. RCEP has a very an ongoing institutional structure of a committee to talk about these areas too. So presumably those ideas will feed into that context where there are a lot of developing economies involved. So I think it's it's a very live area. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, for your very detailed information and explanation shared with the audience and the panel. So I feel that there are plenty of issues that we need to discuss further, but given the time limitation, we cannot have further discussion today. But I think at least today's presentation and the panel discussion will set quite the useful stage for the further discussion about the need to refocus and how to reorient the aid for trade for the developing countries in the region, across the world in the future. And then I hope we can continue our rich and fruitful discussion in the future, taking advantage of the other opportunities. With that, I'd like to thank all the panelists for their insights and the perspectives during this session. I'd like to appreciate your contribution to this session. With that, according to the agenda, I'm asked to say a few words to close this session today. So I'd like to thank everyone for the fruitful exchanges of views and perspectives today. And I think we learned a lot from our distinguished experts during this panel session today. I believe today's discussion is just a start, as I have emphasized before, towards the further rich policy dialogues and awareness raising avenues on the need to improve the Aid for Trade initiative to reflect the challenges and opportunities of the new trade landscape in the future. Our report, Aid for Trade in Asia and the Pacific this year, proposes ways to refocus Aid for Trade towards soft infrastructure in light of the emerging needs for developing economies to tackle the risks and challenges of global value chain disruptions, preference for erosion, new digital technologies, and the growing need for regional cooperation, as was highlighted during the opening remarks by our Chief Economist, Albert Bob. The report is available on the AD website, so I'd like to encourage all of you to have a look. And we are committed to supporting our developing member countries in leveraging trade and digital agreements to achieve their sustainable development goals. And I believe a collaborative approach is crucial to achieve this objective. In this collaborative spirit, let me conclude my by thanking again the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade of the Australian government for their financial support and participation in today's session, as well as the WTO Secretariat for hosting our event and promoting a strong international aid for trade cooperation framework. Finally, I'd like to express a special thanks to our Aid for Trade team, who did a tremendous job in supporting the publication of our report and organizing today's event effectively and successfully. I hope you have enjoyed the session and look forward to learning more about the future of aid for trade in the coming sessions of the Global Review. So with that, let me hand it over to Sean.
Thanks, Jong-woo. So let me just end the session by thanking everyone for their participation today. And just to mention that the Aid for Trade in Asia 2022 report can be downloaded online. The link is shared in the chat box. And I hope you have enjoyed the session. So that's the end of. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.